Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everyone taking the time this evening to join us. Welcome to Amendment 139, Roping Arizona Abortion Rights into the 21st Century. Thank you to everyone from Arizona and the West for joining us during your dinner time. And thank you to those on the East Coast for joining us so late into your evening. And thank you all for figuring out the time. Apologies for any confusion on the time. My name is Katie Ryder, and I'm the National Program Director for Jews for a Secular Democracy. We are a pluralistic initiative of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Our mission is simple: to mobilize Jewish voices for religious freedom through education and advocacy, and informed by a pluralistic Jewish values and traditions, we defend the separation of religion and government. For more information on us, you can find us. You can go to jfasd.org, and I'll post that. Tonight, we are thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar with the Jewish Community Relations Council for Tucson and Southern Arizona and the National Council of Jewish Women, Arizona. We also want to thank our co-sponsors, Arizona List, Society for Humanistic Judaism, Congregation Beth Adam, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit, Secular Humanistic Jewish Circle Tucson, and Congregation Or Adam of Phoenix. Tonight's program is going to run about 75 minutes, so we will have plenty of time for questions and answers after the panelists speak. Use the chat function or the Q&A function to write out any questions you have. During the event, I will be posting awesome opportunities for all of you to help Arizona, and I'll be posting them in the chat. So now let us get started. I would like to introduce Lynn Davies, who is the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council for Tucson and Southern Arizona, the social justice and outreach arm of the local Jewish community here. The JCRC works to educate, advocate, and activate around issues of common concern among Jewish, interfaith, and intercultural communities, and presents values-based programming that celebrates the diversity of Southern Arizona. Lynn also serves on the statewide board for the National Council of Jewish Women, Arizona section, and is a founding board member of Building Out Safe Spaces, BOSS, an organization working to create anti-racist, feminist, and intentionally safe opportunities in the building trades for women, queer, trans, and femme of center folks. Lynn, the floor is all yours.
Katie, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. As Katie said, my name is Lynn Davis. I'm here on behalf of the Jewish Community Relations Council for Tucson and Southern Arizona, and I'm really thrilled to be part of the group presenting this panel tonight. I think you're in for a real treat. In 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the constitutionally protected right to abortion, leaving the legislation of abortion access and other fundamental aspects of reproductive health care to individual states. That decision, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, caused an unprecedented health and human rights crisis for pregnant people in our country. Tonight's panelists will present a comprehensive overview of the past, present, and future of abortion rights in the state of Arizona. You'll hear about the history and criminalization of abortion in our state and learn about the strategy behind the Arizona Abortion Access Initiative, the coalition effort to codify abortion rights in our state constitution. The outcome of this ballot measure has implications not only for Arizona, but for abortion rights throughout the country. I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Civia Tamarkin. Civia is president of NCJW Arizona section and a documentary filmmaker who has been following the struggle over reproductive rights for several years. Her 2007 film, Birthright, A War Story, chronicled the ways in which women had become collateral damage in the aggressive campaign to take control of reproductive health care even before Roe was overturned. So Cynthia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Katie. And we're delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here with so many of my NCJW board members and consultants and members. This is a topic that is certainly, as Lynn mentioned, something that is not about Arizona. It has implications not just across this country, it has global implications because what the US does, other countries follow. We never thought in this century that we would look at Catholic countries like Ireland and Mexico taking a lead when it comes to legalizing abortion, while the United States has gone backward. So roping this into the 21st century, all we're trying to do is get on the ground we were back in 1973. Roe was just the floor. It was not the absolute attainment of a right, as Justice Blackmun said. And so because it was the floor, it left leeway for everybody to whittle away at that, beginning with the Hyde Amendment in 1976, which prohibited Medicaid funding, and moving through the 70s, the 80s, where state by state laws were enacted to restrict access, to put undue burdens onto providers and patients. Finally, in 1992, we had the Casey decision. And the Casey decision, which most of you are probably familiar with, codified the fact that states could pretty much do what they wanted as long as it did not put an undue burden. Of course, nobody defined what that undue burden was. So we found a plethora of laws escalating year by year, which of course culminated in 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus. I would like to note that our generation, my generation, that thought we had attained a right that would never be removed because we believed in stare decisis. We believed once the Supreme Court handed down a right, it could not be revoked. Of course, we have all seen, as I like to say, the Supreme Court giveth and it taketh away. We've seen that with the voting rights. We've seen that with affirmative action. We've seen that with campaign finance. We've seen that with so many things. But reproductive health care especially. Just as the court codified Griswold in 1965 in terms of contraception, then it came in 2014 with the Hobby Lobby decision, saying basically that contraceptives were an abortifacient and they did not have to be covered by health insurance. What is interesting, though, is we were taken by surprise. We did not anticipate in 1973 the onslaught that was coming. We did not anticipate the strategy that the opposition mounted, calculated, how they groomed younger generations of teens and tweens to oppose access to abortion, how they met with leaders from the Republican Party, gathered under the big tent, and decided they needed an issue to galvanize and mobilize support, and they seized on abortion. Let's not forget that the Republican Party supported Roe v. Wade. It was part of abortion rights were part of their agenda in 1972. Let's also not forget that the Southern Baptist Conference supported abortion. So the evolution that we began to see had nothing really to do with the rise of the pro-life. They have weaponized the faith, which Rabbi Bonnie will talk about, just as this Supreme Court has weaponized originalism. But what it comes down to is a very dangerous alliance between anti-abortionists, the Christian militia, and neo-Nazis. It is all part of a white Christian nationalist agenda. And lest anyone have any doubts, if you look at some of the footage from January 6th, what hit me was when I saw an abortion abolitionist, and by that I mean someone who supports the death penalty for women who terminate, someone who had recently been released from prison for bombing a clinic, standing on the steps side by side with the leader of the Christian militia and a neo-Nazi. So that intersectionality is really what this is all about. It's about propagating a white race and servitude and enslavement of everybody else. So speaking of the law that we are trying to pass here, again, Prop 139 is just to get us back to the ground once again. Dobbs was the final nail in the coffin. So now what we have to do is try to build back. And that's what we are doing here. That's what we are among 10 states that have abortion amendments on the ballot. In case you don't know, 41 states have abortion bans. Abortion is only legal in 9 states and the District of Columbia. Among those 41 states, there are various bans. 14 have total, 27 have bans based on gestational periods. But Arizona has been right out there front and center, and in fact served as a model state, test piloting some of the initial restrictions. So we'll call on Jodi, who knows very well what is encumbering everyone's ability to access healthcare and the full spectrum of reproductive healthcare in Arizona. Jodi?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming online and listening. And it was so refreshing to hear a different religious perspective. In my work at the Arizona legislature, very often I hear articulated over and over and over one particular religious perspective. And I think that's true, right, for all of us who pay attention to politics, especially in red states. And you might be led to believe, like, my goodness, is everybody an evangelical Christian? You know, what happened here? I don't want to tread the same ground that Civia already covered, but it's worth repeating. You know, this, where we're at now, has roots going way, way back, back to the original Roe decision and the reaction to that. It's really, you know, totally impossible to disentangle where we are at now with abortion rights specifically, you know, from the kind of, dare I say it, devil's bargain that Republicans made over time with evangelical Christians. And in my view, really exploiting a lot of those folks' sincere belief for just crass political gain, for gaining and consolidating political power. You can take that all the way back to Reagan, working with the moral majority, Bush 1 and 2, co-opting, I would say, evangelicals, especially Bush 2, and basically turning the state of Texas right from one party to another. And no, everyone is not an evangelical Christian, not that there's anything wrong with that. But the reason that we see these laws passed in states like Arizona is that Republicans figured out that abortion is the mother of all wedge issues, that there are millions and millions and millions of single issue voters, and that, you know, some evangelical Christian groups that have a political bent are willing to spend lots and lots of money and do lots and lots of organizing in communities, leaning on hot button issues like abortion to ensure Republican consolidation and maintenance of power. And that is, in fact, what we have seen in Arizona. And in Arizona, there's an organization called the Center for Arizona Policy. They have been active, highly active, ever since the Casey decision really enabled states to, quote, regulate abortion, which really has just been a process of chipping away, very cynically, I might add. I'm not even aware, I've been around since 96 in public policy, and I am not aware that there was even an attempt to work with the medical community or to even, you know, kind of cloak their efforts in any kind of medical necessity other than what they say. But making it almost impossible to run and manage an abortion clinic, right, from a provider perspective, making it as scary as possible and administratively burdensome as possible to be a physician who provides abortions, and then making it incredibly difficult as an individual to get an abortion. And you've heard the laundry list, but things like a 24-hour waiting period, things like admitting privileges requirements, things like banning telehealth, even for abortion medication, something called informed consent. These things sound good, I think, to everyday people, but we know what is written into those kinds of restrictions, and they are absolutely designed to place as many barriers as possible between a pregnant person and the care that they need, and to make it as difficult and as scary, frankly, as possible for physicians and clinics to provide that care. I'll just stop there in terms of trap laws and return to, the deeply cynical nature of all of this. I mentioned the Center for Arizona Policy. Not only have they, not been able to convince the medical community of the need for these restrictions, they have not even pretended. So it's not as if, the Medical Association or the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has been running down to the legislature every single session in Arizona and elsewhere saying, we're worried about patients, we're worried about women, we think that these common sense regulations ought to be in place so that women will be safer. And interestingly, so right, this is not coming from the medical community, it's coming from Christian activists, extreme Christian activists. And it is also, very, again, cynically intended to activate a certain part of the voter base and to prevent women from getting services at all, or to make it, incredibly difficult to do that. So fast forward to the Dobbs decision, and just a dreadful day, but I think the silver lining there is, if the Supreme Court was not going to be with us, at least states like Arizona that have access, where citizens have access to the ballot and can amend the Constitution themselves, could take action. And that is what we have done in the Arizona for Abortion Access Initiative. That will amend Arizona's Constitution and enshrine a right to abortion. There will be so much more work to do after that is enacted. And I think Julie's probably going to talk some about that. All these regulations don't magically disappear, but we have ample basis for lawsuits in the future to get rid of some of those things. And I should just note, just to underscore the fact that, this is not a bunch of sincerely believing Christian people rising up over the years and fighting on behalf of the unborn. At least, that is not what has resulted in the political situation that we're in. This is really well-funded advocacy groups doing this year in, year out to drive turnout in primary elections and general elections. In Arizona, Republicans had a supermajority for 2 years. The Center for Arizona Policy could have passed an omnibus bill with their entire wish list, right? Anything that they could ever dream of. They had a majority, a supermajority in the legislature, and they had a Republican governor. You have to ask yourself why they didn't do it. It's because, one, they need a perpetual crisis to justify their own existence ongoing. And two, this is really about winning elections and maintaining those majorities in states like Arizona, and maintaining control, or trying to, of executive branches. And that's where you see the rest of, I hate to be partisan, but we didn't make it so. There's some sincerely believing, folks who really are concerned about abortion. There's the cynical folks who cloak themselves in Christian values. And then there's business and other interests who have decided to go along with this whole bargain because they get what they want out of a Republican majority. And I think it's important for us all to just realize that that is what is going on, and that everyday people realize, they might have their own personal feelings about abortion, but they think it should be legal, in their gut. And they might think to themselves, am I the only one? Right? Because all you hear out there is anti stuff. Well, we do a lot of polling. We did a lot of polling for the ballot initiative here in Arizona, and 90% of Arizonans think that access to abortion should be a constitutionally protected right, regardless of how they may personally feel or whatever personal decision they might make. So you are not alone. Your friends and neighbors are not alone. We all think that politicians should get out of this business. And I think we will all be ready to move on to all the other things that are necessary for women and everyone to live safe, healthy, and effective lives. And if we could move off of these social hot button issues, abortion being the mother of all of them. So I'll stop there and let you hear from our other wonderful panelists, because I know we've got a good discussion going.
Thank you, Jodi. That's wonderful. I do want to address, as I introduce Dr. Goodrick, someone asked a question, why did the amendment not mention the First Amendment right? And what's interesting is that so many of us who are out in the field advocating for access have moved to emphasize that this is a health care issue. We used to think, early on, my body, my choice. We used to talk about it as choice. And that was a mistake we later learned, because if you don't have options, you don't have choices to make. And we began to understand rights would lead us into a debate over whose rights, the so-called unborn child or the pregnant person. So we have very actively, deliberately, and I certainly hope we all do successfully, focused on this as a healthcare issue. We all hear the stories. You heard Katie Cox, I assume, at the Democratic Convention. You're aware of Amanda Zirinsky in Texas, who nearly died. It's healthcare. And people like Dr. Goodrick, who are on the front lines every day trying to save lives because of all the restrictions, because of all the bans, really face an insurmountable burden, harassment, state interference, not to mention everything that interferes with her just getting to the care of the patient. So, Dr. Goodrick, can you tell us, as someone who has gone through this evolution, how practicing medicine has changed for you?
Thank you, Civia, and thanks for having me. Well, I moved to Arizona over 30 years ago from the East Coast, and I moved here because Arizona seemed like a state of freedom. There weren't a lot of, well, at that time, there weren't any restrictions on abortion. It was part of medical care. It was part of health care. It was, there were no restrictions then. The 90s, the 2000s, I was practicing and I opened a private practice. I worked at Planned Parenthood. Gradually, as politics changed and the legislature again had a supermajority, we had a Republican governor, probably about 2009, 2010, things started to, as Jodi said, evolve and restrictions started piling up. And patients and physicians became political pawns. And that's a very excellent point that Jodi made. It is not because of the health of the woman that these restrictions are passed. Nowhere did anyone in the medical field ask them for help in determining what is the best thing for our patients. And that is absurd. There's no other field of medicine that is interfered with like obstetrics and reproductive health care. And it has an extremely detrimental effect on women. Basically, as we've seen, I mean, you know, we could theorize, okay, if there's bans, but we know from countries that have abortion bans all over the world, the harm it does for maternal mortality, the harm that is from illegal abortions or illegal health care, not safe conditions, things like that. And then in the United States, we just start passing more and more restrictions, making pregnancy care more and more dangerous. And we've seen it. I mean, this isn't something we didn't know would happen in the medical field. And today, I'm sure everyone received in the mail, the ballot, people write in for pro or con for each proposition for 139. I read through them, and all the anti ones were concerned about the health of the woman, that this goes too far, this proposition. This goes too far. And the irony that they're saying that this proposition is dangerous to women is absurd. I mean, having seen it myself over the years and the harm that it does to patients, and it's not just since Dobbs. Unfortunately, with Arizona, there just have been terrible restrictions, and it affects minority, rural women, economically disadvantaged women, much more than other women. And these restrictions have affected health, the general obstetrical care that's provided in Arizona and in other states, as we've seen in Georgia, et cetera. And it's affecting the training of obstetricians. It's affecting the field in general. Physicians are leaving these states. It is shown in studies that have been done since Dobbs how dangerous it is. And so, you know, voting for this proposition, and as it is around the country, getting these things in our Constitution is what has needed to happen for many years. And that will protect women from being political pawns. And that is not, you know, where physicians should be. We should not be pawns. Patients should not be pawns. This does not make things safer. And right before I got on tonight, a decision came down in Georgia, and a judge struck down the state's 6-week ban. And it's incredible news. And it really gives me chills, because I know that the country is going to swing back. This has gone too far. And there's a quote from the ruling, which is really powerful, I thought, to come from a male judge. Apparently, McBurney is his name. And he, I'll quote him, "Women are not some piece of collectively owned community property, the disposition of which is decided by majority vote. Forcing a woman to carry an unwanted, not yet viable fetus to term violates her constitutional rights to liberty and privacy, even taking into consideration whatever bundle of rights the not yet viable fetus may have. It is not for a legislator, a judge, or a commander from The Handmaid's Tale to tell these women what to do with their bodies during this period when the fetus cannot survive outside the womb, any more so than society could or should force them to serve as a human tissue bank or to give up a kidney for the benefit of another." And I just, you know, it's gone too far. And I think that I'm really hoping that like Georgia and other states will start either legislatively or legally through lawsuits challenge these ridiculous restrictions. And so we can get back to important things in the government, and also doctors can get back to providing the care that they need to for their patients. Even in the last 2 weeks, and I was telling Civia about this, you know, we've had patients that need medical care and cannot get it here in Arizona. And one had premature rupture of membranes, another had an abnormal placenta. They cannot get the care they need. The medical exception over 15 weeks is theoretical, but unfortunately in the legal environment with hospitals, et cetera, they are not willing to take these risks. And so that's another thing that was brought up in the of why 139 goes too far, is that, oh, we have these, medical exceptions. But as we've seen all across the country, they are not saving women, they're harming women. And they're so vague that we can't help our patients. So I'll close with that.
I would just like to ask you to please relate a bit about, you've told me over and over again that you see patients who are turned away from some of the most prestigious hospitals in Phoenix. They are turned away from county hospitals. Some of them have been on death's door because of accidents, whatever. Just explain a little bit how, because people wonder, how could a doctor who has taken an oath to save lives refuse to treat a pregnant person who was in a significant automobile accident?
And I have the same questions, but I think I understand it more since we have this situation here in Arizona with a patient. This is a patient who had a very desired pregnancy, and at 17 weeks, her bag of water broke. So it's called premature rupture of membranes. She presented to hospitals for care, for help. Unfortunately, the fetus still had a heartbeat, but it is 100% fatal, that fetus. And the longer the patient goes without having the pregnancy delivered or an abortion, the more dangerous it gets in terms of infection, hemorrhage, other types of problems. She went for 3 weeks trying to get help at one of our main hospital systems is Banner. Well, what do you know? Our Attorney General called the hospital and said, this is a medical exception. This is legal to help this woman. And they refused. They refused. She was planning to go out of state, but we heard about her and we got her in and saw her, and we're going to be using that medical exception. But I'll tell you, I don't think the hospitals use that medical exception more than 10 times in the last couple years. And these things are happening weekly and daily around the country with women suffering and traveling in dire situations, desperate situations, to get the care that they need so that they can be safe and survive.
And it's noteworthy that the hospitals, as someone put in the chat, the hospitals are very nervous about their legal liability. You have, in many of the hospitals, you have teams of attorneys trying to determine how close to death a patient is before they will give permission for a physician to terminate a non-viable pregnancy. And that line has never been defined. I mean, can one be bleeding out and hemorrhaging, septic, or must they be on life supports? But there's also been an attempt to criminalize physicians. I know that your office has been raided many times by state agencies, et cetera, and that people have posed to try to entrap you into providing services. But the criminalization of doctors and providers is only half the story. With the advent of the fetal personhood push in the late 90s, early 2000s, states have turned to criminalizing pregnancy and using other laws on the book in order to backdoor, to justify the existence of a fetus at any stage of development as a human being. So, Julie, take it away with talking about how pregnancy justice has become an issue and the policing of the womb.
Well, that's a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much, Civia. These women are impossible to follow, y'all, just so you know that I know. So the next big frontier after we pass the abortion amendment in Arizona is that we still have to grapple with the fact that we have fetal personhood on the books. And in our state, that means that a fertilized egg has the same rights, privileges, and immunities as you or I. And sometimes it's I hear people, laugh and joke about it. Like, what does that mean? Does that mean pregnant people can use the carpool lane? If I'm arrested, are they detaining my fetus too? But it's so much more than that, and it's so much more nefarious in some complicated ways. So it's been my pleasure throughout my career, as a prosecutor, and now as a civil practitioner, I donate hundreds of hours a year to making sure that people in Arizona have the full gamut of reproductive and evidence-based healthcare. And it was my pleasure to partner with NCJW when we had a case come across my desk of a mama who had hyperemesis gravidarum. At that point in time, if you know anything about HG, you know that you would not wish this on your worst enemy. This is nausea and vomiting throughout the entire 9 months of pregnancy. And about 1 in 3 pregnancies that are HG end up in a miscarriage because mama ends up so malnourished and dehydrated. Nevertheless, when pharmaceuticals failed and there were no other options, a doctor certified this patient to use medical marijuana. It was the only thing that worked, the only way she was able to keep anything down throughout the pregnancy. And when her healthy baby was born, the state of Arizona first attempted to take that child. And when they were unsuccessful, placed her on the Central Neglect Registry for 25 years. With NCJW's help and a host of other amici briefs, we ended up winning that case. And thankfully, Arizona can be on this single issue a shining beacon of light. But I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that there's still so much work that needs to be done. And in particular, NCJW, as one of the lead plaintiffs in SB 1457 lawsuit, which is the fetal personhood lawsuit, it is only because NCJW and others decided to sue on that we're even allowed to continue providing abortions in Arizona. And this idea of fetal personhood is so harmful. We don't have to make up hypotheticals to know how it will be applied. So for example, in Alabama, which also has a fetal personhood statute, there was a case with a mother who was shot in the abdomen by somebody else unrelated to her. And the prosecutor argued that the pregnant person could be guilty of murder or manslaughter because she had a duty to, quote, keep her fetus safe and not seek out unnecessary physical altercations. We know what it looks like because there's a case out of Indiana where a woman was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for a stillbirth because the prosecutors decided that she had self-induced an abortion. And while her sentence was later reduced, there are hundreds of people who have found themselves the subject of a criminal investigation based on nothing but these sorts of laws. We have seen patients who have fallen downstairs, patients who have taken drugs that were legally prescribed to them by their doctors, patients who've had false positive drug tests, people who are addicted and are in need of help, or in the middle of a mental health crisis who've been arrested, convicted, and separated from their families because of these so-called fetal personhood bills. And these bills have the force and effect of turning doctors into cops. They turn wombs into crime scenes. And it doesn't just stop with what we think of as an abortion. They also remove the ability for pregnant people to chart their own course of care. So for those who are tuning in New York, one of the more horrific cases comes to us from your jurisdiction and has been used to force a pregnant person who did not want a cesarean section. They went to court and ended up forcing her to have one that she did not want or need. In Illinois, the way their fetal personhood law has worked is they have appointed, in one instance, a public guardian representing a fetus in court and arguing that the fetus wanted to be born via cesarean section rather than a normal vaginal birth. By the way, that patient was only 17 years old when that happened. And I can tell you as a former prosecutor that when you give prosecutors this much power, it will be abused. And while Roe was still in force for that 50 years, Pregnancy Justice, the organization, was able to find over 1,800 cases over that almost 50-year period that amounted to pregnancy criminalization. Their new study that was just released last week charts the period from Dobbs and 1 year forward. And while I answer one other question that I saw in the chat, I just want you to see if you can guess how many instances of pregnancy criminalization in a single year this study found, keeping in mind that while Roe was still in place, 36 instances a year was about the norm. And to answer one final question, because I see it in the chat, I think a lot of patients very much think that they might have a legal recourse for the abortion that they're not able to receive at some of these hospitals. And I know that because those patients call me in Arizona and say, hey, Julie, do you want to sue? And I say, I would love to. But one of the other nefarious pieces of legislation that our legislature put into place while I was pregnant with my third was a law that immunized all providers against wrongful birth, and the arguments and debate around that law were specifically about providers withholding diagnoses from patients if they believe that patient would obtain an abortion as a result. It allows doctors to lie to pregnant people to subvert, what their will and their family wants. And as a result, it makes it impossible for anybody to get justice in those instances where they have a true medical emergency that qualifies under this very narrow exception, and the hospital is still saying no. And to come on back, if you were guessing, the answer is 210. 210 instances of pregnancy criminalization in a single year.
And what's so incredible is that it has allowed states to manipulate, so child endangerment laws are now a vehicle to do this, not just personhood laws, but all of this is an attempt to build up a body of jurisprudence that establishes the personhood. So I also want to point out that everyone's familiar with the case involving EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment Act. But even under that, in the Supreme Court ruling, they gave it a temporary permission for the moment. But what's interesting is, I don't know how many people are aware, you keep talking about doctors acting and doctors not acting to preserve life. Under the Trump administration, the Health and Human Services Department enacted a civil rights division, which allowed healthcare workers to refuse treatment to patients when their own personal religious beliefs were in conflict. So not only have we had cases of physicians refusing to assist with terminations under dire medical emergencies, we've had cases where trans men have been denied mastectomies, and pediatricians have refused to treat the infant of a gay couple. And it goes on and on. So we certainly need to pass these propositions. We need to begin again to recognize the right to privacy, the right to bodily autonomy. But then we need to expand. We need to take it much further than we ever did with Roe v. Wade, because we never envisioned what the onslaught would have been. With that, let's ask if there's some questions. We have, I believe, about 15 minutes or so. Anyone want to put something in the chat? Any questions? Or any of you? I think it's,
Civia, while we're waiting for that, actually, I think we do have a question about some key misconceptions about the reproductive rights debate in Arizona. I'll take a shot at that, and of course, everybody else chime in. What I was going to say is, another front in this fight is something that Civia touched on, which is the religious refusal, whether it's a pharmacist who doesn't want to dispense birth control pills, or an emergency room doctor, who doesn't want to deal with someone's pregnancy gone wrong because of their individual beliefs. These things are being handled very poorly in operation. I mean, I have problems with, how and why they're enacted in the first place. But then, of course, the administration of them is incredibly problematic. What we're seeing right now, I will focus on the initiative. What we're seeing is our opposition attempting, and they certainly get news coverage. You heard a couple of people on the panel talk about it goes too far. That's become the tagline, and we really have an education job in front of us, helping everyday people understand what a ballot initiative that amends the Constitution does and what it doesn't do and what it all means, because our opposition is taking advantage of people's ignorance and saying, oh, this ballot amendment talks about medical provider. It doesn't say doctor. That would mean a veterinarian or a pharmacist or a chiropractor could, perform an abortion in Arizona. Absolutely not true. And that's just one example of the scare tactics that are being used. Of course, medical professions have scopes of practice, right? There's legislation in place talking about who can and can't do any number of procedures, especially abortion. And this ballot measure doesn't nullify that or make that all go away. There are pieces we may want to litigate, but no, your veterinarian is not going to open up an abortion clinic on the side. That is not going to happen. The same thing, you've heard the rhetoric on the campaign trail, particularly from Trump, this whole notion that it's, a free-for-all, it's abortion up until birth or even after. That's also ludicrous, right? These are things that get reduced to statute over time or get litigated after a ballot measure has passed. And that's where you see the contours of things, but there's absolutely nothing in our ballot measure or any other that has passed or is on the ballot that would do the crazy kinds of things that our opposition is talking about, which, things like any willing practitioner of anything, and, any abortion, anytime, anywhere, at any stage of pregnancy. That's just not correct. And we have a job ahead of us educating the public and voters about that. I'll let others jump in.
And one of the questions there is, how have the current laws in Arizona, and actually I'll say across the country, impacted marginalized communities? Hyde set the tone for it. And with the advent of so many restrictions, state insurance access in Arizona, other state insurance providers and programs, state-sponsored insurance, prohibited. If you are a professor, the University of Arizona, it's not covered. Your insurance does not cover it. If you work in any capacity for a state like Arizona and many other states, if you work for a federal government agency, if you're in the military, no coverage. So who are the ones who are harmed? Those who cannot afford coverage on their own. And it's also impacted communities because more than 90 counties, 90% of the country, there are no providers. So when you don't have access and you don't have financial means, you are out of luck under these restrictions. The other question that's here is, toss this one to Julie. What would a proposition look like that would change fetal personhood?
We just need to do a straight repeal. So what the Republican legislature did when they put in place fetal personhood is, and they were very clever about it. There's a portion of Arizona law that at the very beginning that tells you how to interpret all the other laws. And that's where they snuck in fetal personhood, such that every single time any Arizona law says person, it means a fertilized egg at any stage of gestation. So what do we need? We need either a majority to repeal, or we need to go to court and make the argument that this falls under the amendment that we will pass this November, or we need to run the next amendment, which is I'm going to be talking out of school here, but it's like a 2-year, $40 million proposal. And Jodi looks tired. I know that's not a fair ask.
The need for an omnibus bill, once we get this passed, is paramount, because all the restrictions that are currently in place will continue. This only gives you a constitutional right. Again, it's like Roe. But the legislature, if it remains in the hands that it has been, can enact any kind of prohibitions and limitations on that. And there's a question that also asked what legal challenges. I think I'll let Jodi answer that, because you were involved in the original formation of the Abortion Access Amendment. Everyone's gearing up, I assume.
Yes, we don't have a crystal ball, but the challenges about, getting it on the ballot, obviously those are all resolved. I'm sure there will be attacks after the fact, but we did model our language on language that's been successful in other states, and I leave it to Julie to chime in if she has other information. I will say, not to contradict what you said, Civia, but once we have the amendment in place, it does affect the legal advice that is given to legislators, and they are much less likely to go passing, the super crazy stuff that is obviously in conflict with our, newly articulated constitutional right. So I'm not as worried about the go forward as I am the need to repeal a bunch of stuff on the books, because that is just the quicker way to get rid of it. I have no doubt that we will ultimately be successful in litigation on any number of these things that directly conflict with a constitutionally protected right, like a 24-hour waiting period, right? Like mandatory informed consent that repeats medically inaccurate language, like a telemedicine ban on the provision of counseling for abortion services, or even, handing you the pill if you're doing abortion by that method. Other states are using telemedicine safely for all kinds of services, and we should be able to do that in Arizona. And we think that the ballot measure would clear the way for that. Certainly, you could pursue litigation as a strategy, but we are all hoping that we have the majority that it will take so that we can, yes, with that omnibus bill, quickly repeal these 40+ restrictions that have just made abortion difficult to provide and have created vast abortion and reproductive health care deserts all over our state, because when you stack them like that, it just becomes impossible and clinics close. And then folks who live hundreds of miles away from the nearest clinic are effectively without the ability to exercise their rights, even their very limited rights in Arizona, because they just can't logistically, in practical terms, make it happen with time away from work and childcare and expense for travel. Yeah.
And I would like to note, to pick up on what Rabbi Bonnie had alluded to in the beginning. The other thing vis-a-vis the potential for lawsuits that everyone in Arizona needs to keep in mind is Proposition 137, which is about judicial retention. Two of the Supreme Court justices who would be given terms until they're 70 years old are the ones who voted to reinstate that territorial 1864 ban. Julie, you were going to add?
Civia, you read my mind. If you don't concerned about the way a potential Arizona Supreme Court will rule about this amendment, guess what, Arizona voters, 2 of them have their jobs on the line this election, so vote accordingly.
Correct. There anything else? Then Lynn and Katie, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Civia and Julie and Jodi and Gabrielle, Dr. Goodrick, thank you all so very much. This is sort of the second time, we did this in person back in March, and I am thrilled that we were able to partner with Jews for a Secular Democracy to bring this nationwide in a webinar format, and it has been recorded and will be posted and available for so many more people. So please share. We will send that link out to everyone who is registered when it's available. And again, I can only express my gratitude for these brilliant, amazing, dedicated women who are putting so much energy and effort into this fight. It is just fundamentally, existentially important to all of us and to our partners and our children and our families and our communities. And I don't think we can overstress how much we need everyone's buy-in and everyone's engagement and everyone to vote. So Katie has been wonderful about posting some links in the chat for people who are looking for additional places to engage and to just help support this effort. I believe those will be emailed out to people who have registered, and I trust that they will be. Thanks, Katie, you're amazing. And, part of the recording as well. So with my profuse thanks again to everyone who participated, and Katie and Jews for a Secular Democracy for making this evening possible. Thank you, thank you. And Katie, my friend, my co-conspirator, it's all yours.
No, you said it all. I'm just going to thank one more time, everyone. You were all amazing, and each of you brought an area of expertise to this matter that is so vitally important and needed. I'm going to ask everybody who participated in this, once I share this link out to you, share it with every single person you know. The more we educate everyone on this topic, the more we advocate the more we advocate for Prop 139, the better off we're all going to be, and the more likely it's going to pass. So we really ask you all to share it with your congregations, share it with your friends, share it with your community groups. Let people know how you stand and how you feel. And I will be sharing it to you all in a week or so, maybe less. And I will share all those links with you at the same time. That is it. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Those of you on the East Coast can go to bed now. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Great
Thank you.
conversation. Bye now.